Hi everyone! Today I thought I'd share with you a little tutorial on how I baste and sew the 1/4 inch hexagons using the English paper piecing method. So let's get started! Okay, the first thing I just want to quickly touch on is the tools that I use when I'm doing English paper piecing. So the first thing obviously you'll need are your papers. I actually sell the papers in my shop. You can follow the link in the down bar to my Etsy shop. So you'll need a pair of fabric scissors to cut out your fabric shapes, a pair of sharp embroidery scissors. I use them for cutting the threads, and it also is great at flicking the papers out once they've been sewn in. The most important thing is your needle. I use a size 11. You can see this one is very bent. I've been using this one for a little while. So I use a size 11 milliner's needle. Sure this is going to focus. It has a very, very small eye, and it's very thin and very sharp and pointy, and that just makes it really smooth for when you're sewing the hexagons together. And it means that because it's such a small eye, it doesn't pull the fabric threads apart too much and create sort of large stretched gaps in your seams. For tacking, when I'm doing the miniature pieces, I use just a cotton thread. You can also use, I also do use the Sew Line glue pen, but I only use that for shapes sort of maybe 1/2 inch in size and up. It just depends. I find on the very small shapes this is just too messy to use. And then the last thing is the thread that I use for sewing the hexagons together. For a long time now I've been using Superior Thread's bottom line thread in colour 652. It's a really good neutral colour that blends in with pretty much every fabric. So it's a very fine thread. It's also actually really good to use for applique, and it's very fine but it's very strong. Lately I've been experimenting on a recommendation with Wonderfil's Deco, pretty sure it's the Deco Bob thread. It's also very thin and very strong. What I have found with this thread is that it doesn't tend to twist as much as the bottom line. I do find that the bottom line thread does twist a bit, and even though it's very strong, it can have a tendency to fray a bit if you don't move your thread along through your needle. So the only downside I've found with the Wonderfil threads are that I can't get this colour. I haven't been able to get this colour, and I really like this colour. This is the closest colour, and it's a bit more of an ivory colour. And there's the needles. They're very thin. Okay, so they're all the tools that I use. Okay, so first I thought we'd start with how I cut my hexagon fabric shapes. So a lot of people use a acrylic template that has a 1/4 inch seam allowance built into it, and they will trace around the template onto the fabric and then cut out the fabric, which of course gives you a very nice, crisp, clean, perfect seam allowance fabric shape. I personally find that I don't have time to do that, so I tend to eyeball it. So with the 1/4 inch hexagons, I like to actually use pretty much a 1/4 inch seam allowance. That might seem like a lot given it's such a small shape, but I find it's much easier to hold the 1/4 inch seam allowance on the back while I'm tacking than if you did a seam allowance any smaller than that. So when I'm cutting out, I just hold the paper template onto the fabric and I just very roughly just eyeball a 1/4 inch, and I'm using my iPhone and it's tricky working around the little tripod I've got set up with it, so try and get it in frame as much as I can. Okay, so there's my fabric shape ready to go. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how I baste the fabric shape onto the paper piece. I don't baste through the papers at all. I just baste through the fabric and sort of underneath the folds of the seam allowance. So to start, I've already got my cotton thread. I don't put a knot in the end of the thread. I do a bit of a lock-in stitch at the start so that I can avoid having to do a knot. So you want a nice crisp edge when you fold over your fabric seam, and then you're going to fold the next seam over. Again, you want nice straight edges and a nice point. Then I'm going to go in through and under the first fold and out through the second one. Oops. Pulled my thread too far. So you want to leave just a little tail, and then you're going to do the same thing again. And that just creates a bit of a lock-in stitch, so if you don't pull too hard on this, that's not going to come undone. So then I'm going to fold the next side over. Again, I want a nice crisp edge and point. And now I'm going to go through the top of that fold and underneath and come out. I'm going to pull that through. So that's going to hold, that now holds that fold in place. And then I'll do the next fold. Again, nice crisp straight edge in through the top and underneath. And then same thing again, we do this all the way around. So nice fold over, in through the top of that fold and out. And then the last one, do the same thing. Bit of a tangle, there we go. Okay, and then to finish off, I just go back through that last top of the fold and just go straight across underneath and come out. And then that's it. I just cut the thread then, leaving a tail, and I don't knot it. It should stay in place unless you had if you were using a very slippery fabric, then you might want to knot, probably not at the start and at the end. So if you're using sort of a lawn fabric maybe, or a silkier fabric, you might want to use knots just to keep them in place. But when you're using the cotton patchwork fabrics, I find that you don't really need to use knots as long as you've done enough stitches and you sort of do that locking stitch at the start and that sort of stitch at the bottom. You could do a lock-in stitch again at the end there if you feel like it might come undone. So that's the basted piece. So here's what it looks like at the back once it's basted. And there's your hexagon. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how I stitch the hexagons together. So I've cut myself some of the bottom line thread and I've just put a double knot in the end. So to start, you're going to hold your two hexagons right sides together. And then I'm going to try my best to do this. It's a bit awkward because I've got my iPhone on a little tripod. And try and make sure I get this in the shot. Okay, so you're going to go through the first hexagon in the corner. You're going to pick up just a tiny little bit of fabric. And you're going to go through the opposing corner, again picking up a small amount of fabric as you can, and pull your thread through. And then what I do is I go through the same spot, or as close to the same spot as I can. And what I do now is what I call the lock-in stitch. So you can see I take this thread and I wrap it over the needle and around and behind. And then I'm going to take the thread from this end where it's coming through the needle head and I'm going to go across and under and around. So this is creating like a figure 8. And then you're going to pull your needle through and it's going to create that little figure 8 stitch. Now the reason I do this stitch, I do it no matter what shape I'm using and no matter what size I'm using. And because this is all hand sewn, it's just a bit of added security that if one side was to somehow catch and unravel, it's very easy to just sew that seam back up on its own. Because you've done that knot, the unraveling is not going to continue around the other sides of your hexagon. So we do the lock-in stitch at the start and end of every side. So now that I've done my lock-in stitch, I'm going to do whip stitches along the edge. So I'm going to pick up a tiny bit of the fabric Now if you get your little tail caught, don't worry too much. I'm going to try and uncatch it because it'll be easier for you to see if it's not in the way. I'm just going to hold it with my thumb out of the way. Okay, so I do tiny, tight little stitches and my needle goes through one side of the edge of the top hexagon and out through the back in as straight sort of as possible. I don't go at an angle across the edges, I go straight across. I'm holding my needle very funny because I'm trying to do it with the camera. It's a little bit, it's not how I normally would hold my needle. It's hard when you've got a camera sitting in front of you. Okay, so you can see there I've done about 6 stitches, so I could do anywhere between 6 to 8 stitches. I probably would normally do a couple more than that. It's just a bit difficult trying to stitch around the camera. So now that I'm pretty much at the corner again, I'm going to do my lock-in stitch. I'm going to go in through the corners, both hexagons, and again I'm going to go over and around. Then I'm going to go pick up the thread from the eye end and go around the other side. And I'm going to pull that nice and tight so I get a nice tight knot. So there's the sewn hexagon. So you can see you can barely see those stitches from the front because of how small they are, and also this thread blends in so well with the fabrics. And on the back you can see the little whip stitches. So if I was going to add another hexagon to that now, I'm going to match up my edges to where I want it to be. I might pick a different one. Yep, that one looks good. Move these little tails out of the way. So again, I'm going to go in through those corners. I'm going to do my lock-in stitch. I'm going to pull that tight. And continue on I'm normally a bit quicker than this, it's just hard with the camera in my way. So I'll continue along doing my little stitches and my locking knots. Okay, so now we're up to sewing in the last hexagon to our flower. Okay. So again, I'm going to do the locking stitch. A couple of important things to remember when sewing the hexagons is obviously you don't want to go through the papers at all. If you do, like, it's accidentally go through the paper, it's not a massive deal. You usually can just pull the paper gently and the thread will actually cut through and sort of the paper will pull away. But you know, the aim is that you're picking up just a little slice of fabric on the first hexagon and a little slice of fabric on the second hexagon, and your needle should be going over the top of the edge of the papers. So nice little neat whip stitches are what you want. And you'd be able to feel if you were going through the papers. You can usually very easily feel the paper sliding under the needle. All right. Okay, so at the end again, I'm going to do my lock-in stitch. And now we have the hexagon flower, hexagon flower. So what I do now is on the back is I tie a double knot. So then what we do is I just do a couple little running stitches through the folded seams of the center hexagon, just to bury the tail of the thread. Okay, so there's our hexagon flower all sewn together. So now that this center hexagon has another hexagon sewn to each of its sides, you can now take out this center paper. And because we've done this we've tacked it without any knots, it's a simple case of finding the last basted stitch and using your scissors to just pull those stitches up and out. And you can just pull the basting thread out and then just unfold slightly the hexagon, and using your... Okay, sorry about that, stopped recording. So then you can just flick that little hexagon out and just fold back those seams so it lies as flat as possible. And there you have it. You've sewn a 1/4 inch hexie flower. Okay, so to finish off, I thought I'd just share with you this piece that I've been working on, one of my long-term projects. And you can see that all these hexagons that are hexagon flowers that are completely sewn in, they don't have any of their papers anymore in the back. So this is sort of what the back will look like. And you can see along the edge that when you're connecting the hexagons, you do it in the exact same way as you made that first hexagon. So you hold the two sides of the adjoining flowers together, the two matching sides. And I would go in with a knotted thread, do my lock-in stitch, move it over, sorry, do my lock-in stitch, sew along the edge, do another lock-in stitch, and then you'd fold that out and those two sides would be joined, and then you do the next side. So then I'll do another lock-in stitch there, sew along this side, do a lock-in stitch, and when I folded that out, this hexagon here would then be completely sewn in, and I'd be able to pop out that paper. I like to pop out the papers as I go because it makes folding the hexagon sides much easier when you've got a bit of give in the fabric. Trying to, fold this over, if there was a paper in there, you fold in the paper, and that also means that you won't be able to, your papers won't last as long, because if you start folding your papers, they're going to start getting a bit tatty, and they'll, for example, some of these papers I've used a fair bit, you can see that they've been folded, so that when you're then tacking these papers, they're a bit more flimsy. They don't hold as straight and stiff as papers that aren't folded. So I do reuse my papers. I try and get as much use out of them as possible. I don't get rid of them until they start to get really, like this one's starting to get really like sort of floppy and bendy, and it's just not as stiff anymore. So once they sort of start to get like that, that's when I throw them out. So I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. I hope you found it informative. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me. I'll put my email address in the down bar. And please like this tutorial if you have found it useful. And don't forget to subscribe to my podcast, to my channel. And that way you'll always know when I've uploaded a new tutorial or I've uploaded a new podcast. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back again soon with another tutorial on a different shape. Bye!